Good morning, students. How are you feeling? Welcome to the fourth day of Baltic Summer School of Digital Humanities. And today we will start with a very exciting lecture. I've been waiting for this for several months already. I'm very proud to present you Tessa Gengnagel, who is the co-director of the Cologne Center for E-Humanities at the University of Cologne. And she is currently one of the leading figures behind critical digital humanities. Probably she's very shy, but she is one of her research interests next to the scholarly digital editions and cultural heritage is the history and epistemology of digital humanities. So looking critically what we are doing, evaluating our methods, and not just blindly trying to work with data. So I give floor to her. The title of today's lecture is Computer as Archive, Computer as Agent. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here and honored to be invited to give this lecture. Maybe I'll just also add a few words about my work at the Cologne Center for E-Humanities, so you have some idea what I'm doing in my day-to-day work. So at the Cologne Center, we are mostly involved in DH research projects as a digital partner, so to speak. So we are supplying the concept for the digital humanities component of digital scholarly editions, for example, or other similar type of projects, and then we are also implementing them. So in my day-to-day work, I'm very much involved in designing DH projects and managing DH projects. But the kind of talk that I'm going to give today is more aligned with my personal interests, which Anna already detailed to some degree. So I see myself more so in the tradition, you can also almost say, of critical digital humanities. And we also have a working group in the German Association for Digital Humanities where I'm part of this working group. So that's where I'm coming from. And the presentation that I'm going to give to you today is a combination of different things that I've been working on. So I don't have just one research focus. I'm working on different things that I think are interrelated. And that's, on the one hand, the history of digital humanities, or humanities computing, because of course it didn't used to be called digital humanities. And that's another big question, what even is digital humanities? Maybe you are familiar with these types of discourses about the definition of digital humanities. And this is even more important when we look at it historically, because this change to, in English, DH is a very Anglophone dominated community. This change to digital humanities happened around the year 2005. Maybe you are aware of this, but in any case, I'm just starting from that point. And before that, there was also humanities computing, and then in different countries, different languages, there are very different traditions, also depending on if we're looking at literary studies, history, art history, and so on. So looking at the history of computer application in the humanities is pretty complex, and I'm going to talk about that. But I'm also going to talk about questions that touch on the epistemology, and that's where also my interest in the history of humanities computing comes from, because there are different ways to approach this. If you're a historian, you might be looking at computing history from a different perspective than I am. I did study history, so I have some sort of historically influenced thinking, but I suppose for the most part I am a digital humanist. So my interest is, for example, in looking at discourses and the history of ideas. Okay, so I'm interested, for example, in something like modeling theory. Perfect, thank you. So I'm fairly flexible when it comes to the length at which I talk about certain aspects of my presentation, so this is not an issue. So I'm interested in modeling theory, and I think it's a good thing that I'm talking now at this point in the summer school, because as far as I know, you've already been doing a lot of data modeling in different capacities when it comes to something like network analysis or network modeling, or network visualization rather, I should say. And okay, maybe let's just move on. the thing is that a lot of things that we do in the digital humanities are influenced by methodology from information science and computer science, and that makes a lot of sense because we're using a lot of computational methods. But on the other hand, there is a way to think about theory that's not just about methodology, and that's where the history of it comes in, and the history of ideas specifically. And I'm starting from a thesis that's influenced by Hans-Christoph Hobom, who is a librarian, library scientist. And in 1991, he has an article where he writes about the epistemology of computing in history. And it's called Historia ex machina, and I have some quotes later if we can get to that. And so he says that there is this idea originally of using the computer as an archive. Okay, simple enough. And then in the early 90s, when he's writing, he's saying, and now we are starting to use the computer more as algorithm, so to analyze the things that we've indexed and storaged and where we've modeled the data, and we have all these database systems. And the thesis that's underlying my talk, and there's a question mark to it, is whether we are entering a new phase, which might be characterized as using a computer as agent predominantly. And of course, this is related to generative AI, agentic AI, and so on. So just to point this out, but I will come back to this at the very end. And this is the basic structure of what I'm going to talk about. First, before we get into the history of the digital humanities, I want to take a look at the concept of meaning. So I'm not going to dwell on this for too long, but I think it is important because meaning does not just exist in a context of digital humanities where we have to think about what we do in relation to what we apply it to and the statements that we derive from what we do. But there is also something that we have to think about in terms of meaning in the humanities. Because what we do in the digital humanities or in humanities computing is often, but not necessarily done, to answer questions that we have as humanists. And that's why I want to start with that, and then also go on a little bit of a tangent again about the definition of digital humanities. And then we get to the history of it, and then to modeling, because I think that is one of the core areas of the digital humanities where we can think about it as a metadisciplinary epistemological task given to computing in the humanities. And so my starting point here is an essay or an article written by Erwin Panofsky. I myself am not an art historian. I did talk about art history in my dissertation on digital scholarly editions because I was writing about the idea of editing material that's not just text, and then it also goes into semiotics and other areas, but art history is obviously also a big part of that. And I think Erwin Panofsky, from a German perspective, is one of the great humanists of the 20th century. And he has this book called Meaning in the Visual Arts, and there's one article in it about the history of art as a humanistic discipline, and I think it's well worth reading from a cultural heritage and just generally humanities perspective. And so he has this quote, "Man is indeed the only animal to leave records behind him, for he's the only animal whose products recall to mind an idea distinct from their material existence. Other animals use signs and contrive structures, but they use signs without perceiving the relation of signification, and they contrive structures without perceiving the relation of construction." And he goes on to say, to perceive the relation of signification is to separate the idea of the concept to be expressed from the means of expression, and to perceive the relation of construction is to separate the idea of the function to be fulfilled from the means of fulfilling it. So we don't have to go into this too deeply, but I think the idea is clear. He's talking about the fact that, and this is one approach to what we do in the humanities, obviously it doesn't cover everything that goes on, but he says that there are these types of records, as he calls them, a kind of material survival of some sort of what we call cultural heritage, expressions of thought and culture and human existence that goes beyond traces of a physical existence, of a material existence. And then he says these records have to be decoded and interpreted. So that's where this important aspect of interpretation comes in. And he says, finally, the results have to be classified and coordinated into a coherent system that makes sense. So that's his approach to meaning making in the humanities. And it's very structuralist in a way. So that's also, I suppose, where a lot of the almost accusations come from, that the digital humanities are neo-structuralist. So that's a whole other debate. I know that some people disagree with that, but there are some pointers to it if you just think of structuralist meaning focused on structures, which structuralism as a movement was always a bit more complex than that. And actually, I don't think it had that much to say about structure as such. But so in his case, and he also talks about the fact that to interpret these records, we need to think of the spatio-temporal structure that they emerged from, the stream of time that they emerged from, where it's only in relation to where they come from that we can actually say, well, he says the year 1400 means something different in Venice from what it means in Florence, and so on. And then, of course, if we look at other factors, it gets a lot more complex in addition to that. And there's also something in, and this has also been cited in the modeling theory discourse in digital humanities from Willard McCarty, for example. There are some writings about modeling in the humanities, but not that many. So this is a kind of methodological reflection that never really took place in the humanities. And I think that's where we see some of the issues when we talk about modeling in digital humanities, because there are a lot of types of modeling happening. And there's, of course, a new type of modeling being introduced when we talk about large language models. But again, in terms of conceptual modeling, this is something that already happens in the humanities, and there's at least one article, and there's a bit more, but this is the one that's often cited. And Gordon Leff, so he was a historian and hermeneuticist, I guess you could say. He says, history cannot be systematically studied or written unless the historian observes the criteria which are peculiar to it as a body of knowledge. For that, a conceptual framework is necessary, which, however empirically founded, becomes intelligible only through following the same intellectual processes of definition and inference necessary to all conceptual knowledge. That framework is provided by the historian's models, which, as mental constructs imposed upon the evidence, make the facts speak in response to his prompting and not of themselves. So Panofsky also talks about the fact that there needs to be a frame of reference that we can relate the one object or the one phenomenon or whatever we are looking at. We have to have some frame of reference in terms of spatio-temporal structure, but also in a broader sense of where we are embedding it into, and so the type of contextualization that we do. And you can see from this type of thinking that this already exists in the humanities, and of course the way we structure the periods of history, for example, would be some type of modeling, some type of conceptual modeling. And then when we go into the digital humanities, we carry a lot of these implicit models into what we do in terms of explicit data modeling. And lastly, on that point, there's also from media theory, I think there's also some worthwhile literature to look at. And so, for example, in this case, Bernard Dionysius Gegen, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, he has this book, Code from Information Theory to French Theory, and he also looks at cybernetics and MIT and how structuralism was entangled with colonial record keeping at the time. So there's all kinds of entanglements of different movements, and he writes about, this is not a main point, but in some margins, he also addresses the distinction that is sometimes made, or the dichotomy between data and theory. And often when you look at digital humanities literature, you will also find this talk of two cultures, which is a reference to C.P. Snow, that I think is very misplaced, because the context of what C.P. Snow was talking about in the 50s is always completely ignored. But so you have this idea of, okay, there's two cultures and somehow they're incompatible. But he says, that the supposition of incompatibility speaks less to enduring methodological alternatives than to ongoing struggles over distributions of interpretive power and credit within a broad theoretical community. And then he follows up, this means present struggles over cultural analytics cannot be addressed in terms of two cultures or simplified oppositions between data and theory. Rather, the problem of cultural theory is immanent to digital humanities. Conversely, digitization and communication theory structure cultural theory and its notion of signifying systems. And so he's writing about digital humanities in a sort of narrow understanding, which is very influenced by an Anglo-American view of digital humanities as being about literary and linguistic computing, which is also where digital humanities history or historiography gets its start. But in any case, I think one of the things that's important when it comes to what he is writing about is the fact that, and he doesn't even say this explicitly, but there is something to be said for the fact that a lot of what is happening in the humanities today, or in human life, is happening in a digital space. So there are some interactions between what we do in the offline scholarship, if there is any offline scholarship anymore, and in the online way of thinking about it, so the digital and non-digital, or however you want to phrase it. So there is some interaction that we also have to think about in terms of representational paradigms. And so that gets us to something that I could have also placed at the very start, but I wanted to talk about this general notion of meaning in the humanities first. Again, when we talk about digital humanities, normally we talk about it at the very least in the European context or in the German context. We often talk about it as a continuation of humanities computing, because a lot of the same actors who were in what was called humanities computing then they were responsible for the changing of the field or the name of the field to digital humanities. That was a very conscious decision. But there's also this intersection with public humanities. There's an intersection with new media studies. And then at the very end, there's this notion that digital humanities is humanities in the digital age. And as I just said, I think there is something to be said for how digitization changes what we do in the humanities in general. But there is something distinct about what we do in the digital humanities or humanities computing regardless. And it has to do with a more conscious effort of computing information and knowledge from the humanities. So it's not just about looking at the effects that digitization has on the humanities, but it's about actually using computing to address questions in the humanities. And then there are some, you can also differentiate from computational linguistics, which has its separate tradition, but also kind of came back into the fold of digital humanities. There is the development of computational humanities, if you're aware of that. That was founded around 2019. Then we have cultural analytics, which is, again, sort of its own thing, but there are intersections, especially Lev Manovich is very prominent in that regard. And then, of course, with AI, we have all kinds of intersections between humanities and computing or the digital that are birthing all kinds of literature and discourses. So it can be a little difficult to look through that. But critical DH, you would think of someone like David Barry, or you would think of someone like Anne Catherine Hales, who's not primarily a digital humanist, but I think a lot of her writings are relevant to what we do in the digital humanities. And so here's just one example from our center, and this is work in progress. So this is not in any way, shape or form like a final presentation of anything we've been doing. But this is the type of thing that you probably are working towards also in what you learn at the summer school. So we want to learn about knowledge modeling, about data modeling, about the relation of entities to each other, and to use that to navigate, for example, in this case, conceptual knowledge that is derived from work on some sort of knowledge domain. And this is an old slide. This is in no way a taxonomy, but again, just some of the things that you would traditionally have expected from digital humanities. And you can see it's a wide array of things. And when we look at changes that are happening in the field now, they are entering this at different stages. So I think we do have to differentiate, but the focus of my talk is more so general, because if we only look at the singular use cases of what we're doing, if we're looking at the singular method and the singular outcome, we don't have a way, if we don't have a theoretical framework, we don't have a way of addressing how this is meaningful in a systemic or systematic way. So for me, at least, that's the reason to address theory. Theory, if it's just theory without application, that's no good either. But if we have application without theory, again, we don't have a way to give it a systematically relevant meaning. Okay, so let's take a look at the history of humanities computing and what it might tell us about some of the ideas that are underlying how we think about computing and what we can do with computing. Because it's not so much about what computers can do when we look at digital humanities. Normally it's about what computers can do for us or what we can do with a computer. But those are all very different things. And so the history of digital humanities, even if we don't think of it consciously as a continuation, what we're doing, even if we don't think of it as a continuation of what came before, there are a lot of these conceptualizations that underlie how we approach what we do. And so this is, I think I have time to play this in full, it's just 1 minute. This is a promotional video from IBM. I don't know if you know, IBM as a company was very involved in the history of digital humanities and humanities computing. And so this is going back to the basics of the history of humanities computing, which is normally traced back to Roberto Busa, who was a Jesuit priest and in Italian. And after the Second World War, he goes to IBM, to New York, to the CEO, because he wants to create an index of the work of Thomas of Aquinas. And so there are all these anecdotes about how he goes to the CEO and convinces him to help him with this humanistic endeavor. And then in 1958, after the Dead Sea Scrolls have been found, IBM also latches onto that and the idea that there could be a computation involved in the reconstruction of text. I mean, there's some sound, it's not that important.
Holy land of ancient scrolls tightly rolled up and stored in caves along the shores of the Dead Sea. Scholars are still carefully studying their rich story of a religious community 2,000 years ago whose ideas seem to be the forerunners of Christianity. But the Dead Sea Scrolls are very old with many parts missing and must be treated with great care to preserve them and then studied with all the resources of the human mind. One of these resources is an electronic data processing machine, the IBM 705, which a Jesuit priest and an IBM engineer have taught to serve this ancient branch of scholarship by compiling an index. Father Busa and Paul Tasman have put almost 30,000 words on punched cards, and these in turn have been electronically transferred to 2 reels of tape. In analyzing and interpreting very old documents, it is important to know how often each word appears and precisely where. This takes most of a scholar's time. Months of drudgery which each must perform for himself are minutes' work for the computer. The computer can also provide missing words by using mathematical probability techniques. Not only does this machine help man plan his future, it lets him understand his past.
Okay, so of course technologically this is not that interesting to us anymore, the way they were working with punched cards. I mean, in terms of media archaeology, this is interesting, but not so much in terms of what we do today. But what is interesting is the areas of application that they are looking at the time and that they are looking to use computing for. And a lot of them are exactly the ones that we are using it for today. Machine translation, the automatic collation of manuscripts, automatic transcription. So a lot of these tasks are very similar to what we see computers being used and have been seeing them being used for decades. And a lot of this is rooted in this idea that the computer is a helper or servant, some of them call it a servant, that takes over menial tasks and just performs them a lot faster. And so now the scholar can spend their time on more interesting aspects of the work. And I mean, that's fair enough. It's a very valid understanding of what a computer can do. But still, I think it's very interesting that in some regard we haven't moved on a lot from the idea of where this could be applied. And then in 1960 there is a symposium in Tübingen. I'm going to play the clip but without sound because again it's not that important in this case. But in 1960 there is an international symposium in Tübingen, and there, okay, it's frozen anyway. And there we have again, this idea of encoding information on punched cards. And what's interesting about this international symposium are the people who are there. So you have a lot of the pioneers in literary and linguistic computing, but you have also someone like Peter Thoma from Georgetown University. He's coming up later in the clip, this is not him. But Peter Thoma, he was working on the first software for machine translation, or the first one that was actually in use by the US Air Force and then later the European Commission. And a lot of their motivation arises also from their, I think, biographical details. So the experience of World War II plays an important role. And I just wanted to mention that because there is an entanglement of politics and humanities computing right from the very start that we also normally don't look at. And Roy Wisby, he was one of the participants at this conference in Tübingen in 1960. And he has a theory why medievalists and classical philologists were some of the first to make advances in this field. And he says it's likely because in these disciplines, one is forced day by day to proceed pragmatically, collecting evidence, since valid literary insights can only be gained on the basis of painstakingly compiled comparative material. So that's where we see the roots of a lot of the activities in digital humanities, because a lot of them at their core are about the representation of cultural heritage. And that's also why we see a lot of intersection with work at cultural heritage institutions, such as museums, libraries, and archives, and the digitization happening there. And it's not only about metadata, although that's very important, but it's also about this idea that we want to make what we digitize accessible in a semantic way. So there is something in there that we recognize, and we do gather this knowledge through our scholarship, and now we want to make it machine readable so we can query it and analyze it in some way. And that's also why this idea of something like TI, text encoding, comes from, although there are question marks around that, but a lot of it becomes about encoding information in this context. And then to wrap this up, this section, I think there's still something interesting because there are people also in the 1960s who are aware that there's more that could be done with computing. And there is, for example, in the very first issue of the journal Computers and the Humanities, which is a very important journal for those early decades. In the very first issue, there is an article, it's a few pages, but there is an article by Louis T. Milic, who also is involved later on in computer poetry. So computer art, computer poetry, again, all of this plays a big role right from the start. And I think it's very interesting what he writes. He says, a more serious effort ought perhaps to be made involving a genuine willingness to put the creative powers of the computer to the test. The generation of poetry or of music is obviously not an end in itself. As scholars involved primarily and ultimately with the mystery of the creative act, we are always responsive to what we can learn about the creative process. Making simple models, which can produce music, language, design, is only a primitive stage of this investigation. Far more complex models with considerable autonomy, self-correction, and even introspection can be visualized. Such speculations are not fantastic, they are at the border of reality. by abandoning our conception of the computer as merely a mechanical clerk suited mostly to repetitive routine operations, by learning to know its features, uses, limitations, and possibilities, its nature in short, we shall be properly reorganizing our thinking for the new age. What the computer will enable us to do in our humanistic tasks has hardly been imagined yet. Even immoderate speculation tends to fall behind the new reality. And this is, to me, very interesting because I feel like that's true even today. And that's not to say that there aren't being innovative or imaginative things, that they aren't being done in the digital humanities. I think there are very interesting things happening in the field, and I've been in the field for more than 10 years, so I think I do have a fairly good idea of what's happening. I also was at the DH conference in South Korea last week, so but still there is always a sense that what we're doing emerges from interests that we acquired prior to engaging with this, and maybe there is some sort of inhibition attached to that. And then when we look at the history of humanities computing, so those are all very, I wouldn't say traditional ways of looking at the history of computing. Okay, I'm getting faster at this. So looking at literary and linguistic computing as one area of early humanities computing is, I would say, fairly traditional, although a lot of this has not been explored either. I don't know why it's keeping going out. But there are other interesting areas that have been somewhat neglected so far. And that's, I think, because there is also a sort of domination of what is accessible to people interested in humanities computing. And as I mentioned at the very start, there is a sort of domination by Anglophone literatures and scholarship. And that means that some developments are not taken as being part of this history of humanities computing. And I think the field of cybernetics is one such case, because cybernetics, if we look at the situation in Germany at least, which, as you will know, was divided for most of the second half of the 20th century. If we look at the history of computing in Germany, normally people, well, I mean, almost always, people only talk about the history of it in West Germany, although in East Germany they did write in German, so theoretically we could read what they wrote. But this is not seen as being part of the history of Germany today. And that's interesting because something like cybernetics, which was very popular in the in East Germany more so than in West Germany. In cybernetics, that so cybernetics was founded after the Second World War by Norbert Wiener in the US, and it was intended as a universal science. And it was about information theory and communications engineering and also systems control. And there was a pacifistic idea attached to it, which we also saw with machine translation and Peter Thoma. But in the West, broadly speaking, very simplified, cybernetics declines in the 1950s in popularity, and there are different reasons for that. In East Germany, meanwhile, and also in the USSR, it gains in popularity in the 1960s and becomes a very important field of investigation. And this is especially related to the topic of modeling theory when we're looking at it from a perspective of digital humanities today. So in East Germany, they are very concerned with cybernetics and modeling theory and computing of history and humanities in that regard. But so far, nobody has really looked at that. And I'm currently writing a paper about it, so that's why I'm mentioning some of this here. Here we see some of the examples of what it would look like to work with punch cards. I mean, some of this was mechanical, more so than what we would think of as computational today. But regardless, it's more about the concept of information and data modeling and information retrieval. So if we're looking at these histories, we not only have to look at something like cybernetics, because it was very popular in the 1960s and 1970s, and before that also in the 1950s, you know, depending on where you look at. We not only have to look at cybernetics, but we also have to look at something like archival and information science. They are discussing a lot of the questions that would be relevant to us today. And this is just one example. So there was, for example, this philosopher Georg Claus at the Academy in Berlin, which was in East Germany at the time. And he was a philosopher, but he was very invested in cybernetics. So it wasn't just engineers, because in West Germany, Karl Steinbucher was the main proponent and also a pioneer of artificial intelligence. Karl Steinbuch, he was an engineer. And you could also look at the biographies of these people and how their involvement in the Second World War plays into all of this. But regardless, you can see differences. And I think this type of ideological disambiguation that arises from the overt competition of systems in the writings of these people, like I'm talking about the discourse here, that's something that's very interesting to look at, because of course we don't see that in humanities computing or digital humanities today, not to that degree. And so I looked at a lot of documents, and this is strictly from the perspective of East German historians and philosophers and writers who are concerned with these things, and they define themselves in ideological opposition to West German academics. And these are some of the aspects that they highlight. So in East Germany, they say we are doing our information modeling in history in a way that's value-based, because we have to do it in this way. And in the West, they are saying they're doing it in a value-free way, but that's not possible. And not only is it not possible, it's not desirable, because it would undermine our political goals. And there's a lot of interesting writings that we can look at for that. I don't want to go into too much detail again here, looking at the time, but still I think it is important to get some idea of the type of literature that I mean. So we have someone like a historian like Alfred Lösdau, and he talks about this aspect very explicitly, and he's a party loyalist, so I should add that. And he, for example, goes into this whole, he doesn't reject cybernetics wholesale, but he says the cybernetic de-ideologization, which he attributes this to Western sociologists and academics. And this entails, as a last consequence, the abandonment of socialist ideology. So you have a very complex situation where some people are in favor of cybernetics, some people are against it, and some of this extends to politicians. But a lot of the discussions that we see about quantitative methods in humanities, information theory, a lot of this connects to that, because there's no clear field in which these discussions take place. Computer science as well is only forming. In West Germany, this happens under the term informatic. So there are, at least in the 60s, in this time, there's a lot of movement in that. And then you have also historians like Vorberger and economic historians. So a lot of the early histories of computing in history that we see comes from economic historians, people working with statistics, which they already did before computing even enters the picture. And so he connects to something that the Czechoslovak historian Jaroslav Purš says about cybernetics and history. And so again, these are all things that are now being looked at currently. There's not a lot of literature to fall back on when we talk about these things, but I do think it belongs to the history of the field. And he says the tables used to measure these phenomena therefore already presuppose a considerable degree of knowledge of economic theory, and we agree with Purš when he asserts, without theory, there is neither scientific statistics nor scientific historiography. So I think that's an important point. And we would add, nor is there any application of cybernetics to economic historical phenomena. But cybernetics is not everything that is commonly understood by the term. Cybernetics is not merely the processing of large amounts of data by machines. That is at best a mechanical simplification of statistical work, and often an essential prerequisite for cybernetic work. Statistics too reveals relationships and has long since developed tried and true methods for this purpose. But from cybernetics, economic history surely expects above all a better elucidation of the inevitable relationships, including their quantitative aspects. So I think here we can see why something like modeling theory plays a bigger role in these discussions than in other discussions of information theory at the time, because it's very much about modeling systems and their components and their relation to each other. And that's just something that I wanted to highlight as we now go into modeling as it's been understood in the digital humanities so far. So what we see as modeling discourses in the digital humanities does not connect to what I just showed you. I just wanted to show you that to emphasize that there were a lot of discussions about modeling already before, in the context also of the humanities and Gesellschaftswissenschaften, societal sciences, and so on. So, modeling in the digital humanities is normally equated to knowledge and data modeling. There are other types of modeling, and of course, we see that a little bit with something like 3D modeling. But generally, when people write about modeling in DH, and when they say that modeling is at the core of the digital humanities, they do mean knowledge and data modeling. So there is an epistemic paradigm attached to it. And I do think that's interesting, because as we just saw, there can be ideological components to modeling concerns because they approximate the making explicit of a worldview. And that might also explain why there might not be a crisis of modeling in the age, but it explains why crisis in the world may be reflected in modeling concerns. I think that's something to keep in mind, because modeling is meaning making or making sense in the context of the digital humanities. And there's a lot of publications about it. There's an article by Dinara Gagarina about data and knowledge modeling, and lots and lots of literature. And a lot of it looks at modeling through a semiotic lens. And this publication by Willard McCarthy, I think, marks perhaps the end of what we used to call humanities computing and the transition into digital humanities, because he publishes this in 2005, and that's exactly around the time when the change of the name of the field happens. And he has a chapter on modeling in it, which is often cited as a very important publication. He has also papers that he later wrote, but they are not as present in the discourse. And so, he says, my starting point is the fundamental dependence of any computing system on an explicit delimited conception of the world or model of it. By modeling, I mean the heuristic process of constructing and manipulating models. A model I take to be either a representation of something for purposes of study or a design for realizing something new. These two senses follow Clifford Geertz's analytic distinction between a denotative model of, such as a grammar describing the features of a language, and an exemplary model for, such as an architectural plan. Both kinds are by nature simplified and therefore fictional or idealized representations. And this connects to a history of modeling theory that goes much further back, even to someone like Hans Weihinger, who was a neo-Kantian philosopher who wrote about the philosophy of as if. And that was about fictions, and so that's a tradition of philosophy that's called fictionalism. But there, fictions are essentially taken to be models in the sense that was developed in scientific modeling after the Second World War, where there's this idea that modeling or models, their purpose is very much connected to a certain kind of usefulness. So it becomes about the usefulness of models for a certain application, but I would say that it's also connected to a cognitive turn in the philosophy of science after the Second World War. And we see this, and again, here's where the context of cybernetics comes in and communications engineering, because a lot of these modeling theories, also scientific modeling theories from the 1960s and 70s, they have a very strong idea around the fact that models do not just represent some real life phenomena, but they are about communicating information. And this is a very simplified model or representation of that that I made for an upcoming publication. So you have this idea, there is a modeler or there are modelers, and they construct a model which represents some sort of selection of a world phenomenon or something that we perceive. And it's always selective because it's not everything in it. If you look at a geographical map that you want to use for driving somewhere, there will be streets in there highlighted because that's the road that you want to take. But maybe there won't be information on whether there are cornfields next to the street, or, you know. So there's all kinds of information that's not going to be in these maps because it's not relevant for the purpose that you're using it for. Whereas if you're a farmer, maybe that's what's relevant for you. So that's a very simple example. And of course, mapping, geographical mapping is a special category of modeling. But just to give you an idea of what this is about. And we could complicate this further by going deeper into modeling theory, because there are these layers that are normally denoted, at least in the German discourse, with something like Urbild. So you have the Ur-image of something, which derives from observing something in the world. And then you have the Abbild, so a representation of that. And in German, there's this very strong imagery connected to this terminologically. And then this can also be used as a Vorbild for something. So a model can also be something like a prototype, or you could see this with an architectural model. So there's all these different kinds of ideas of modeling. But then when we look at something like large language models and all the modeling language that comes into play from that, we're talking about model collapse and world models and this and that. For example, the representational layer is very complicated, if at all distinguished. And so, again, I don't want to overcomplicate it now, but there are all these aspects that we have to consider, and this goes hand in hand with talking about formalization and operationalization in the digital humanities. And this, of course, all impacts the type of meaning making and making sense that we can do. And this is talking about the conceptual modeling of it. When we then implement that in a certain data model or with a certain technology, there are other technical or otherwise restraints that coming into it, affecting this even more. And this is my way of distinguishing certain modeling interests in the digital humanities. They are related, so this is not a taxonomical distinction, but I think the main interest, and this relates to knowledge and data modeling, is the inscription and visualization of meaning and relation. Of course, a lot falls under that. And then we have something like computation and regeneration of cultural expression, which becomes more important when we look at generative AI. 3D modeling with the recreation of objects, artifacts, and spaces. And then we have something like 4D modeling, where it's more about the simulation of spatio-temporal events. So simulation becomes more important, and the spatio-temporal structure becomes more important. Again, these are all interrelated, but just to give you an idea of the way I think about this, and then you can also pull up a lot of examples of technologies and libraries and models and all kinds of things for all of that. But again, this is not a taxonomy. This is just a highlighting of certain things that we do in the digital humanities and why they are so dominant. And this is another visualization of that idea that I had in the earlier visualization. So there are all these interactions. I mean, Panofsky focused on the record of something. So maybe the humanist will look at the manuscript. But then we also have a digitization of that manuscript. And that combines with the information that we can see in the manuscript that's not in the digitization. For example, a watermark that might not be in there. And then maybe we are creating an edition, a scholarly edition out of that. And if it's a printed book, there's also a lot of information that's not in there. And if it's a digital scholarly edition, there's other information that's not in there. So this idea of loss of information is always important, but I think it's wrong to attach this to digitization itself necessarily. We already had a lot of loss of information in traditional scholarship, in some regards even more so, because we did not have a representation of the material visual aspects, for example. And then aspects like reconstruction come into it, which are sourced from circumstantial evidence, which is not actually in the primary evidence that we're looking at, but it informs the type of information that we encode, if we encode this information explicitly. And even in the age of generative AI, or perhaps even especially in that age, we see the importance of that when we look at something like retrieval augmented generation, because this idea that we need a knowledge base becomes ever more important the less the regeneration of cultural expression is rooted in an actual being in the world, although there are representations of world knowledge in language and cultural expression themselves. Yes. And so that's where we are now going with generative and agentic AI. And this is too complex a topic to really, I think, get to the bottom of here. But I want to connect this to what I said earlier, that I think our imagination of using this is very much guided by the type of activities that we have been doing, and now perhaps we can do them faster or in autonomous loops, something like that. So there's a paper by Christopher Pollin and others about, this is in the context of scholarly editing, digital scholarly editing, and they have this visualization, and they sort of, I mean, when you look at the types of things that LLMs and other, I mean, machine learning under the term deep learning has been something that's been discussed in the field since at least 2017. I mean, also before that, but in the terms of deep learning was really that it became more of a discussion in 2017, and artificial neural networks also became a big point of discussion in 2017. So there was already a lot of talk about using certain technologies for certain scribal detection and this and that. But still, I mean, we're in a different world now. And a lot of it is about OCR, a lot of it is about named entity recognition, for which we have traditional natural language processing methods, and some of which may work better and some of which may not. Then, of course, translation and retro conversion from print is a big thing, at least in the German context, because that's where people are coming from in the humanities and what they want to have done. And then something also like UI, UX design. And in another paper by Michael Schonhardt, he is demonstrating their workflow in the project that he's working on. And again, you can sort of see where this enters into it, the training, the fine-tuning, using certain models for certain things. I'm not saying this in any way negatively. I'm just pointing out that there are specific use cases for these things so far. And sometimes the question is whether these are the best use cases for a certain technology. Maybe certain technologies would be better used in other ways. But we're almost never thinking about it from the perspective of what is this technology good at. We're thinking about it from the perspective we are doing an edition project, or we're doing certain things, and now we are looking at, okay, maybe this can help in parts of the process, or maybe this has certain benchmarks that help us improve parts of the process, but the types of projects that we're doing are very much the same. In the German context, that's of course also because a lot of these projects are very long running. And so you can't change the project design every 5 years. And you do have to produce a reliable resource. So that's another aspect to it. This whole idea that's been very prominent in the digital humanities, that we are trying to do something that's sustainable, which is extremely difficult in a digital context. And frankly, in other disciplines, and we see that in Germany with the way also certain policy measures are being made around data storage and computing centers at universities and what their tasks should be. There's almost no understanding that in the digital humanities, we want to preserve a resource after a project is done. So we can't just throw it away. This is something perhaps not completely unique to digital humanities, but it is very special, and it's also connected to an open science principle that's been, at least since the 1990s, very entrenched in the field, and can perhaps be called its most ethical principle, or it's not the only ethical principle, but the most prominent ethical principle. And this is now, of course, also somewhat at odds with some developments that we're seeing. And so people are creating these types of matrices where they are trying to evaluate also the environmental impact and societal impact of using certain technologies. Maybe this is too far away from what projects are doing in their project work, but that's why we are seeing these types of discussions. And for example, at our center, so we do things like fragment matching in a new project with papyri from crocodile and human mummies of Teptinus. And again, I mean, we could go back to the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they were also trying to reconstruct text. Of course, our possibilities and capacities are completely different now, but the application scenario is fairly similar because humanists are still interested in the same things, and digital humanities projects are often designed from a humanist interest first. And perhaps people who are active in the digital humanities also need to perhaps they also need to say, okay, there's also things that we are working on in terms of methodology and epistemology that would be relevant for the humanities, but we can only do them from the perspective of digital humanists. And if we could prioritize those, I think we could make a lot of progress in different areas. And so this is just from another presentation, sort of parachuted in here. It's just to show that there are also you kind of have to differentiate on the way to something that we would call agentic. There are lots of different configurations, and that was from June, so it's not completely outdated, but of course these things are moving at a very fast pace. And there are costs associated with it, so there's a pragmatic component. It's not just about which technology is best. There were technologies also, for example, in printing history, that were much superior to the type of printing that we have today, also in producing something like facsimiles, but they went out of style because they were too expensive. Anyway, just to show you the kind of decision-making and thought process that goes on at a center like ours at the moment when we're thinking about how this changes processes. But it's always about certain steps in a workflow. And so far, I think it has not really impacted the overall project design. Which brings me to the end, and I think I'm still on time. So as I mentioned, this idea of computer as archive and computer as algorithm, I derived that from this article by Hans-Christoph Hobum. And I used to think that he was very correct in his assessment, but after looking at the history of humanities computing more, I don't know if I completely agree with this timeline that computer was always thought of as archive and then as algorithm, and now it's thought of as agent. I think rather we see something that, and I think it was David Barry who said this, we rather see that all of these things are at play, and that our imagination about developments, current developments, and I think I've stressed this throughout enough, fits into these categories. And so, to quote David Barry, I have it in my notes. I think I wrote this down from a presentation that he did. I hope I'm not misattributing something to him that was not said by him, but I think it was from David Barry. To quote, "This is to situate the age within the humanistic disciplines more firmly in relation to meaning, and asking what is a life worth living. In other words, there is an urgent need to reconfigure quantification, formalism, and instrumental rational processes away from domination and control towards reflexivity, critique, and democratic practices." Of course, that's in a context of a talk that he was giving that also went into different topics. To continue the quote, "To give an example of this, we might look at the emergence of a new technology, artificial intelligence. One would think that the age would be able to offer a substantive way of thinking about it, but in actuality, AI tends to be squeezed into the foundational categories of the age by its practitioners, who move swiftly to ask about artificial intelligence as a tool and artificial intelligence as an archive." And I think maybe as a last word, there used to be a concept of this before these new discourses came up, and that's why I named Anne Catherine Hales at one point, because she talked about cognitive assemblages, and I think this is something that we need to discuss in that vein, but we didn't do that beforehand either. So this idea of interdependence on the systems that we're working with, because it somewhat goes against the idea of a singular scholarly authority. And perhaps in that way, it's also a challenge to the core of the humanities, and which I think maybe tends to be most ignored by those who actually care the least about what's actually going on in the digital humanities. So that's also an observation that I have. And I think there's no crisis here, but what we have to do is read what's out there, because there's a lot out there, as I showed with the history of humanities computing, but people generally don't make the effort to look into these things, and that shows a certain lack of time. I understand that, but there's also a lack of curiosity, and without curiosity we cannot engage in conversations about meaning, and that's completely regardless of whether that's in the humanities or the digital humanities, or honestly, human life in general. And I think I will end it at that. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Tessa. This was very thought-provoking. I am looking at hands. I hope this time I have also time for my questions, but because I think this speaks to every philosopher in this audience. My first question, well, I'm not seeing any hands yet. If you let me move a little bit further away from particularities of your presentation. So I'm wondering about this connection of the model and the theory, and I will explain. Mm-hmm. So to simplify, theory is something much bigger, model is something smaller. Scientific theory is an explanation of some aspect of the natural reality. It's something big, and it might involve a general model, some smaller models within it. It's like, for example, like evolution theory, or germ theory, or maybe even climate theory. Those are scientific theories that are proven enough and are used to explain the world around us. And the models is something might be smaller. One model can represent one object or person, or also some aspect of reality. It is a formal representation of an aspect of reality, oftentimes simplified, abstract. Sometimes it represents reality more precisely, sometimes it's more abstract and more simplified. And I know that especially at the end of 90s, the beginning of this century, those people who worked in emerging digital humanities theory, like Franco Moretti, they were dreaming of being able to create theories for literature or broader cultural theories, to be able to explain culture as a reality, mm-hmm. to see bigger trends, similar to as we have described the natural reality. And there were hopes that with the help of digital tools, we will be able to do that and spot these larger patterns in the cultural reality, because before it was not seemed impossible because the cultural reality was too complex for people to describe it coherently and create convincing theories. Of course, there were still theories, they're not as strict as the natural sciences, but still there are theories. But do you see that there are any theories emerging from the digital humanities? Because I think there are still mostly hopes and realization that we might be looking into this more.
I'm not personally aware of something that I would call a theory emerging from the digital humanities. I think so far what we've seen are concepts or methodologies, or conception. Sometimes they're more concepts than specific methodologies, but certain methodical or methodological concepts have emerged that have been very impactful, which is also why someone like Franco Moretti and distant reading is always... so there's more an idea about how to look at certain things that's emerged. I would also say that there is an issue in the sense that, well, first of all, and also Rabea Kleiman has talked about this, when we talk about theory in the digital humanities, we normally talk about methods and methodology. But there's also, I think, we don't really have a definition of what we mean with theory. And theory is a very, depending on the discipline and science that you're looking at, theory means something very specific in terms, and also the differentiation between theory and thesis and axiom and whatnot. And so what we're talking about in the digital humanities is often more so influenced by a soft, putting this in quotes, soft understanding of certain terminology from cultural disciplines. The same goes for terms like experiment. So we're not using this in a very hard-coded scientific way. It's more of a general understanding. And this wasn't your question, but maybe as a point towards that, when we're looking at the difference between a model and a theory, I would maybe more so look at the difference between a model and a concept, or a conceptual model and a concept. Because I was also asked this once, what the difference between a concept and a model is. And I would say the difference is that the moment the concept has an identifiable structure, it becomes a conceptual model. Because I think the structuralist impulse that we see there is important. The moment you have identifiable or identified entities and a relation between them, you're moving towards talking about a model of something. And this model can reflect a theory or a thesis or a concept, but it is something that's closer to something that can be translated into computable structures because it has an identified structure, even if it's not necessarily identified in a way that's directly computable, but you delineate things. And in terms of theory, I mean, I think maybe this is for certain disciplines. I know that in medieval literary studies, sometimes people, because of the work they've been doing in digital humanities, they develop an understanding of a certain source that's different from the common understanding in scholarship that goes against the common scholarship. So I suppose in that sense it could be a new theory of how to read or how to interpret a certain kind of work. But I don't know if that's a big enough use case to call it a theory really emerging from digital humanities. And also, maybe as a last point, I didn't talk about this, but for example, Panofsky, in his definition of the humanities, he talks about natural sciences a lot, and he contrasts a lot the cosmos of nature and the cosmos of culture and all the differences there. And I think what I've been seeing is that I don't think, and this also goes to the aspect of epistemic world modeling that's been sort of tried in DH. I don't think that we do have something like that in the humanities. that can be really tested against what we do in the digital humanities, or rather, I don't think that what emerges from the digital humanities could really make a claim on that scale, because people can't even, or they don't even use something like TI, text encoding, the same way between two projects. There's simply too much perspectivity involved in the way we ascribe certain interpretations and meaning to certain knowledge domains, that I would be very skeptical, at least, but I would be interested in seeing something like that. But all the big scale, large scale projects, something like the Venice Time Machine, and this is not my personal opinion, this is just something that's been that was reported in the media at the time, they failed. They didn't, they overpromised and underdelivered.
Meanwhile, other comments from the audience? But I would be glad to just do discussion. But yes, please, audience.
Okay. Yes, thank you so much for the fascinating talk. I have like two questions. One question was to just see the slide again with the AI risk.
This one?
No. No, that even further back. It was about the social.
From Jonathan Jalstella.
Yeah. Okay.
That was from his paper for the Academy in Mainz.
Okay, that looks very interesting. Okay, but now the real question. You talked. You had a huge variety of topics, and you also highlighted, at least what I understood, also a lot of what you could imagine also as gaps. Woman missing in the video about Father Busa, not talking about politics, not talking about East Germany or the East or the Global South. And then you talked about modeling. And my question is like, if modeling is a conception of the world, and are these gaps a problem of the modeling, and what are the implications? What do you think about this?
I mean, the models reflect, at least in the traditional view, the perspective of the modelers. Of course, the more something enters into it that is not a conscious representation, but involves implicit data biases, for example, by using LLMs in research without exactly knowing the kind of data bias that is involved. That is something that enters into it in the sense that Lauren Klein and others talk about data feminism in the context, data bias in the context of AI use. So in that, it's more about, and of course, I mean, models, if we're talking about knowledge representations for certain knowledge domains, they will reflect the gaps in the knowledge and also by whom it is modeled. But again, like what I'm saying is that there are more complications entering into it, and these groups and also people, they tend to be the ones focusing on that the most, or calling attention to that the most. I'm not sure if it completely answers your question, but yeah, that's what I would say. So, I mean, the model reflects, but it's both conscious and subconscious. It's not. I would not say that it's necessarily a problem, so long. I mean, it is a problem in terms of what it means about the workplace and so on. And Busa and Julian Nyhan has written about that a lot. But I mean, in terms of what the model represents, it simply means that we have to be aware of what's in it and what's not in it. And so that's also why you see developments, something like data envelopes. So trying to publish data in a way where you actually describe what's in it and what's not in it, which doesn't completely eliminate the perspectivity of a model, but there are ways to address that a bit more consciously. But there's a lot of factors at play.
Any comments? Yes. Okay. I was hoping that I will be able to talk the rest of the time. Just kidding.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. What you're talking right now about modeling and bias is an issue that I have with my work, because I'm modeling an identity in the early modern context. And also it's a bias from the ontology engineers. For example, by implementing CDOC CRM, you have issues because you can't talk really about social concepts. It's easier when you're defining, material culture, because CDOC CRM was basically made for modeling museum data and museum artifacts. But do you think that we can really model everything in regards to the living world, to the world that we understand as humans?
I don't think so. Or at least I think the digital humanities, interestingly enough, never asks, can we model this? They just ask, how should we model this? But I think that's often the wrong question, because I don't have the answer, but I wouldn't be surprised if we found that there are things that cannot be encoded or modeled in certain ways. Even if we only think about something like cultural heritage, if we suppose that we need some kind of digital representation to attach certain kinds of encodings to, there's also intangible cultural heritage. And then often also when we look at something like word modeling in these conversations, it's about video. It's about maybe also, some sensory input, and that's at the intersection with robotics. But a lot of it is actually, when you look at it from a humanities perspective, it's not that, it's very narrowed down to something very specific. A video recording of something is not always, or often, it's not an adequate representation of what it shows. Like it's an audio or visual, or audio, maybe an audio-visual recording, but so the whole question of how do we even get a digital layer of representation to begin with, that's and then the modeling on top of that. But I think that there are things that are difficult, if not impossible, to model in a way that would be computable. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
Hi, I'm working in America, I'm working on a poet's digital archive. So my question is about the last phrase that you used, artificial intelligence as an archive. I would like you to elaborate on that. I assume that it's not just meaning for a repository of knowledge. And you mentioned that as an important concepts like meaning creations and making meanings and curiosity. So if you could elaborate that computer as not just an agent, but an archive with a reference to the meaning creation and curiosity. Thank you.
Okay. So with the artificial intelligence as an archive, so this is the way that David Barry, I believe, put it. I think what he means by that is that it is a reference to this idea that we can use these technologies as a different way of knowledge retrieval or representation. The representational aspect, I think of it, people do not generally make that claim, but the way we conceptualize using this, people do think of it, maybe not necessarily always in academia, but I think sometimes also in academia, they do think of it as something to retrieve information with or from. And I think that's the relation to something that's called archive. Also, in terms of the term archive, I should note that in digital humanities, and also, for example, digital scholarly editions, there is a tendency to use the term archive in a literary scholarly way, which is also distinct from the way archival studies has talked about some topics. And Michelle Caswell, I think, wrote an article about this. I don't quite remember now, but there are people also from archival studies who criticize the way the term archive is used in digital humanities in general. So it's a very general purpose term, With digital scholarly editions, there's also this, okay, we're talking about the archival impulse versus the editorial impulse. So this idea of a collection of something that is maybe in some way, shape or form not close to being added to, but it's a somewhat enclosed environment. For example, I think that when we talk about something like artificial intelligence, that's clearly not what's meant when people talk about it as archive. It's more of a living repository of information, but that's a very again, that's a view on archive that just intermingles with this very general idea of archive as some repository of knowledge, of information, not in a strictly data sense in the digital humanities. And as to the question of curiosity, I'm not sure if I completely understood how I should elaborate on this in relation to archive, but I think maybe this also goes, well, first of all, the exploration of what the term archive even means in this context. So for me, it's also the terminology that we use in a lot of places. Actually also the term knowledge and also the term information and the relation to the term data. Usually we look at this with the data, with the pyramid of data at the bottom, and then we have information and knowledge and maybe even wisdom above it. But there's no consensus on what these terms actually mean. And I was also at the DH conference last week during the keynote. I also had this thought that a lot of the way people talk about artificial intelligence and knowledge and retrieving knowledge or interacting with the knowledge that is in there somewhere, I feel like we need to have a bit more curiosity, not just on how the technologies work specifically, which is very important, and what they're being applied to, but also the way we talk about them. And that has an anthropomorphizing aspect to it, but that's not the only thing. I think it's really more about having definitions, which is not to say that those could be the only definitions of something like knowledge or information, but the way we are working without definitions, also when we're talking about something like structure, I think makes it very difficult to actually communicate about what we think is happening. Because people use these terms, and also the term model is very famous for that. People use these terms in all kinds of ways, but then it becomes difficult to find a common ground. And I think also that's the task for theory work in the digital humanities, to propose certain kinds of frameworks to talk about these things, and then to have the curiosity to go deeper into both the history and the literatures and also other disciplines, what people have said, like in archival studies, and to look beyond the immediate vicinity and also in other languages and other countries and so on. And then also to find new ways. With the curiosity, I mean, for me that goes a little deeper because actually the term, for me there's also in the epistemology of the humanities, in the German context, there is a tradition of, when we go back to Dilthey, and this has been also, there's different controversies or discussions about that even in the digital humanities context, but there is also this idea of something like empathy or the capacity for perspective taking playing an important role in humanities scholarship. And I think that would be something interesting to think about in relation to something like the technologies that we're seeing now. I can't completely say what kind of scenarios this would play a role in, but we've kind of eliminated even talking about that aspect of humanistic meaning making, because it's become part of certain methodologies in certain fields. And so for me, it goes into the broader epistemology of the humanities themselves.
So I have a question that is very important for me. This is why I leave it to myself to ask maybe the last question or the question before the last question. So I am thinking a lot how large language models are affecting the way we do digital humanities, and also whether they would make digital humanities more useful or less useful to people, to researchers. And I try to distinguish between models, like what we need to describe the reality and how we used formalization of our questions before, just to being able to communicate with computers. For example, before we had topic modeling, we tried to cleverly ask the question to the computer, like combining keywords, thinking of clever methods, how to like extract information about the topic from the text. And we had to be very formal just to be able to convey this message to the program, what we want to retrieve. So we were formal just because it was the way how we communicated with the computer. And gradually, even before the large language models, there were ways how we could just do it without like being too formal, like just for the necessity of that. And when we have large language models, we do not need to pose our questions as formal requests. We can speak in a natural language just to ask the question. But still, models and structures are necessary for describing the subject we are researching, and how to distinguish between these models which just were needed for the communication of the computer and for those that are needed for describing the subject we are researching. And nowadays I see that a lot of the things that were important for digital humanities are just omitted because we do not need these structures anymore, because we can just ask questions. And again, other people are saying, no, let's not throw away structured data. Let's augment structured data with artificial intelligence. This is what we try to do at the libraries, because say we have this pristine data. And let's not just ask questions and enter chaos, but work with systems we already have. So what's your perspective on that?
Yes, so I think in some regard there might be some practices in the digital humanities, for example, TI encoding, that I don't think they are going away, but there are discussions, and also I feel like a lot of conversations at conferences. The question is, for example, with TI text encoding, what are we doing this for? What are we encoding these structures for? If it's for certain type of queries, or if we want to find out certain things about a text corpus, then maybe we don't have to do that anymore, because we can just do a natural language inquiry. However, I think that there are some aspects to this. For example, with TI encoding, I don't have the impression that people have been doing it for more than 30 years, because they are doing a lot of analysis with the structures and the information that they encode. I feel like for a lot of people, it's part of the process of becoming aware of what it is that they are actually doing. And so I think that has been attractive to a lot of humanists, and that's why they've spent a lot of time on these kinds of things, like text encoding. And that's not going to go away. Plus, depending on what kind of information you encode, you might still want to use that, or things that we are seeing are experiments of having machine learning aided encoding, or TI encoding. So you make some training material, and then the rest is encoded automatically, because for some reason people still want the encoding of these structures, and also because there are decisions involved in making these types of representations. But certainly the more it is about textual information, for example, or certain information that we have good methods of gleaning otherwise, I think there might be a change to practices coming. But as I also mentioned, something like retrieval augmented, if it's really, the more it is about representing certain types of knowledge and knowledge relations, I think the less it is going to be completely obsolete. But maybe it's going to be a bit more specific of what do we need to encode, because it represents our argument about a certain type of source and the way we see it at this point in time. And what are questions that we want to ask of the material that we might also be able to get to otherwise. But again, I feel like a lot of the encoding that has been done in digital humanities has not been specifically to then use that to address questions, which is also interesting. But yeah, I think it highly depends on certain things, and also there are people who prefer not to write natural language prompts because they feel like if they're doing it, or the more they do it in a structured way, the better the results. So again, there's also the question of, in an academic context, what's the methodology there? Outside of the academic context, again, that's something different, but you need to have some kind of argumentability of what it is that you're presenting as the result of what you're doing. And the more you delegate that, the less you can, you can present something, but then there's the question of reliability of information. And that goes for a lot of things. So at the conference, there was a very interesting paper by Catherine Bode about also the way different probabilistic, there was with BERT, but also something like probabilistic methods, there's different, it's very complicated. So anyway, that would be my question, that I don't think it's going to go completely away, but certainly people should put thought into what they need to encode and what they don't need to encode. Yeah.
Thank you so much. How about another round of applause? And with that, we conclude our streaming.